So in my previous video, I coated this with absorbent ground. It's a piece of hardboard. And I used a roller to put the texture on there. And I thought it would give it a texture similar to like rough watercolor paper. I've got this image of some boats that I want to paint. So this is a wash of cerulean blue. I think I might actually start with the magenta. I just want to get some color mixed up on my palette first. Quinacridone magenta. It's one of my favorite colors. I used it in the video about how to mix purple. I really didn't do too much sketching on this. I like to do a lot of the drawing with the brush. I don't like putting in so much detail that I feel restricted with the brushwork. So I just put the basic shapes in there. Like I have like the basic outline of the boat and the horizon line. That's about all I need for now. I'll start with the magenta. I don't want it too bright. You want it to be kind of like a pinkish color. And then I'll transition over to the cerulean blue. So I'll rinse out my brush because I want to get more of a pure cerulean blue in there. And this is the first time I'm using this palette. That's the one from my video about how to prevent watercolors from beating up on a palette. And I want to see how many paintings I have to go through until this thing gets broken in. It's not too bad. I mean, it's usable. So I'll put some more blue. All right, so I think, should I put some phthalo blue in there? Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, maybe. Phthalo blue is way more potent than cerulean. All right, so that's probably good enough. The texture is not so bad. It does kind of look like rough watercolor paper. I want it to go into the water, so the water's down here. I'll add a little bit more cerulean to the top. All right, that's pretty good. I think it was too light before, so I'm gonna dry it. I think the next step might be the landscape in the background, the trees, and there's like a little building in there. Some yellow. I already have some blue on here. I have phthalo green, and that is super potent, but you can dull it down. You just add, there's a bunch of different colors you can add to make phthalo green a lot duller. One is the magenta will do it. I think I'd like to have a darker green, so I'm going to use ultramarine blue. Actually, what I could do is make a purple and mix that in there as I go. So I'll get some of that ready. That'll be interesting. I think a little bit more water. That's the thing too, is this doesn't really absorb water like paper does. So you really can't put a ton of water on here. And the other thing you want to keep in mind is that you don't want to have a super steep angle because all the water will just drip down to the bottom. So I have this at a lower angle than what I normally work at. So here's some of that purple just to get some dark shadows, shapes in there. I like drawing with a brush. Like I said, if I do too much drawing with a pencil, I get carried away with the details and then I sort of freeze up when I paint with the watercolor. So this, just working with the brush, it keeps it fresh. Trying to figure out how far down I'm going to take this ground. That's the other thing too, is you don't really have to follow your photograph like perfectly. You can invent your own colors. And you can also just move horizon lines wherever you want them. And all right, so I'd like to add some more color in there. I think a darker purple. It's good to add extra colors in there when it's still wet so they can spread around. This dark area behind the building will help make it stand out more. Maybe a warmer color. I got some yellow oxide. That help? Uh-oh, whoa, that's too much water. Swoop, hip. All right, it's gotta work with it. I guess you can lift it because that just totally removed like what I had in there before. I could fix that later. Yeah, that's interesting. This texture, it's hard to get like a straight line. It just sort of bleeds into all the nooks and crannies, but I'll just have to work with it. I could probably soften that edge. Like I don't like how that does that so much. It'll help make it look like water too if the edges are soft and it flows into the water, kind of like that. So I'm gonna hit that with the hairdryer again. I think I need to work on the boat a little bit, get the shapes established. So some cerulean blue and quinacridone that I have left over here makes a nice purple. So I think it needs to be more cerulean blue than purple. So I'm adding some cerulean blue onto my palette. And yeah, I think that's better. The boats have a lot of strange shapes. You really don't want to draw every single one, but I need to sort of define this. It's interesting. This edge is crisp, but this up here, I think maybe because that's still slightly wet. The boat, oops, so this is what it's like to paint with watercolors. You just have to adapt as it goes. I think that's fine. All right, I don't want to overwork that, so I'll move on. And these small piers, I could add that in. I think maybe like a burnt sienna would be nice. Add a little purple. Putting these shapes in first. Now if I paint into the hull of the boat, it's going to bleed in there, but that might be interesting. See what happens here. All right, so now the thing about watercolor is you can tie shapes together, and this, I don't know if you, what do you call it, a piling? It's connected to the boat, and then the pier will also merge into that shape. And then what I like to do too is I like variety in my washes, even when I'm like drawing these different shapes. So I'm taking some of this darker purple, which is the ultramarine, and quinacridone magenta, and I just drop it in there when it's still wet, so it'll spread around. It just gives it more interest and depth. And it gets darker here, right where it meets the water. I don't know if it's because the wood is rotting more there in that area. I do like the warmth of that burnt sienna. There's like a rope tied around this. I think I might throw that in there real quick. Just, you gotta paint those things quick. All right, so I kind of have to make up this area. I think it just goes straight across. But the reflections, I'll just have to wing it. I think I'll put some of those shapes over the boat. I don't know, that's still wet. That's gonna bleed like crazy if I put that on there. So I'll put this building in back here. I also like the shape of the branches back here in this one tree. I could probably go darker with those branches or with the foliage up here. So I'll do a second layer in some areas. Lifting is where you take a wet brush and you scrub into the painting to remove some of the pigment. I think I'm going to try it on the boat because I'd like to get the highlights on here to be more white. So let's see if that works. It does look lighter, but I might resort to gouache to make that lighter or totally white. I think the next step would be to put the shadow in for the boat, like the ripples. And then that way I can let that dry, and then it would be easier to paint these other pilings after that. I think a good color would be a dark blue, like an ultramarine blue, and then do some variations on that. Add the quinacridone magenta to make it more purple. It might be good too to have variations in the color of the water, like maybe make it go more towards phthalo or more like a greenish. Maybe I'll put a little bit of phthalo green in there. I'll try it and see if it looks good or not. I'm using burnt sienna to make that a little bit warmer in some areas. And when you mix it with ultramarine blue, it makes a neutral color. You can use it for shadow colors. I think this needs more blue in here. So I'm trying to preserve this little bit of light area. That's actually the top of the pier. This is the shadow of the pier. It's hard to keep all that straight in your mind as you're painting, but now this, I think the shadow needs to continue here, like sort of indicate the top of the boat, like maybe right there. So if I just, then maybe let it just fade out. Like that's the shadow of the pier. This is getting complicated, but I think it'll pull together when I get it all in there. Now I think maybe I could just indicate some ripples in the water in the foreground, but it will have to be a lighter blue. I don't want it, oops, that's pretty intense. All right, so maybe just a little, it'll be nice if it merges in with that shadow or with the darker areas of the reflection. The thing about water is when you paint it in watercolor, you're really just painting a symbol of water. If you paint every single ripple, I think it would look a little bit too complicated or fussy. I think it helps to soften some of these edges like I'm doing right here and let it drip down a little bit. Maybe in the background, just a light indication in some areas. I do think that could be a little darker, like right here. I think that darker blue purple color will tie it into the boat. I think it's time to define this boat with a darker color just to make it stand out more as the focal point. So even though it's white, if you look at the photograph, the color in there, or the value I should say, is a lot darker than white. So it's one of the things that can fool you when you're painting, is value. I think the trick to getting a sharp edge on this absorbent ground is to not go too heavy with the water, because it will gather up in the depressions of the texture. So I might even add a little bit more. Ooh, that's quite a bit, and let's see how that looks. I think the thing to making watercolor painting look expressive is just to let the pigment do what it wants to do, like let it flow into the wet areas. But then there's times where it goes into areas that you don't want it to go into, and you have to lift it a little bit. And so you're always on the edge of like losing control of a painting. I think maybe now the shadow has to be darker. I think this color will help tie the shadow of the boat together with the actual boat. I think it's a little bit confusing. So I think that's starting to come together. Maybe a little bit of variety in there too. A little bit of magenta, and then like I said, burnt sienna is always a nice addition. Oops, probably too much. I'm thinking about what areas of this painting are the darkest, and it seems to be these pilings and some of the shadows. Of course, that's going to bleed into my water. I'll just let that dry before I go any further with it. I think some of these areas could be a little bit darker. Sometimes you can brace your hand with your other hand. So this is the point where I feel like I need to figure out what this painting needs. And to me, I have to finish up this building here, and I think I don't know if I should put that boat in behind there. It's just not very clear. I think it would help if this was a little bit lighter here. Like it needs variation in there. Like there's ripples in the water. It's pretty nice the way that you can reactivate the paint. Oops. Must have got a drop on there. I can fix that. I think I might try some Indian yellow on the pier. I might have referred to this as yellow ochre. It's actually Indian yellow. Just want to indicate that that's like wood. So I think that the boat needs something behind it, and in the reference photo there's like a bush that comes out. So I think I'm gonna put that in there. And then there's some dark shapes behind there too that help make it stand out. So I'm going to try and put those things in there. And another thing I noticed is that, see how that's not beading up anymore just because I let it dry on there maybe twice? Looks pretty good. I mean, that's almost, see these outside edges aren't because I didn't let the paint dry on there. I think I want like a brighter yellow if I can clean this out a little bit. And I have to be careful because this is going to define the edge of the boat, so I don't want it to be ragged in those areas. And if I can, maybe I can scrub out this horizon line a little bit. So you can lift on this. It does show a little bit of a ghost pattern, but So now I could go in with a brighter yellow because I scrubbed out most of that color. I'll carry this green all the way down. And I also think it will help to put some more pilings in there. I don't want to put as many as there are in the photograph because that's just too distracting. So ultramarine, magenta, and some burnt sienna. And like I did before, I want this to be drier than normal and thick so that it doesn't spread too much. So keep adding more pigment in there and I have to balance it out. All right, so let's see how well this, yeah, it's pretty thick. Which ones do I put in? There's a big one right there. I don't want it to be in the center though. So maybe there's that one. And then there's some that break the horizon line here too. It's like, they go straight through there. There's a couple more back here. And there's more piers that creates like a dark shape. I think that'll make that boat stand out a little bit more. So I'm going to put the finishing details in this painting. Instead of using white gouache, I use titanium white